The day Lucas Bennett called me, my world tilted on its axis. I thought I had seen it all: grief, betrayal, and the quiet heartbreak of being forgotten by your own child. But nothing prepared me for the words that came through the receiver. Bethany, there's something inside the coin. My late husband's most prized possession, the ancient Athena coin, the one my son stole behind my back, was hiding something far more valuable than gold. Inside, Lucas found a photograph of a woman I had never seen before, and a small ornate key to a secret Daniel had taken to his grave. At 77 years old, I thought I had nothing left to discover. I was wrong. If you've ever wondered what hidden truths your family might be keeping, stay with me. Because this is the story of how I uncovered the betrayal of a lifetime, hidden in a coin, and quietly took back everything that was mine. I woke up that morning with the weight of 77 years resting quietly in my bones. The light streaming through the curtains wasn't just morning sun, it was memory. A memory of all the years I had given away without hesitation, of all the mornings that began with someone else's needs before my own. My name is Bethany Wallace, and as I lay there, I couldn't help but wonder how much of me remained after a lifetime of giving. There was a time I was more than just a mother and wife. I had dreams. I had a sharp mind hungry for knowledge and challenge. I once wanted to become a history professor, to travel the world, to stand behind a podium and share knowledge with young minds. But life had other plans. Or maybe I allowed life to make those decisions for me. I met Daniel Wallace when I was just 22. He was magnetic, successful, confident, the kind of man who seemed to have the future wrapped neatly in the palm of his hand. I fell in love quickly, deeply, completely. The kind of love that makes you forget your own ambitions, because his dreams suddenly felt like they could be enough for the both of you. Daniel was a financial strategist, a man who understood numbers and markets better than anyone I'd ever met. But his true passion wasn't in finance. It was in history, more precisely in rare coins. His collection began modestly, a small Roman coin he picked up during a college trip to Italy. From there, it became an obsession. He called it his quiet legacy, a collection not meant for the world to gawk at, but for him to cherish in the silence of his study. He would spend weekends polishing the coins, reading up on their origins, sharing snippets of history with me over tea. I listened, always attentive, because his eyes lit up in those moments in a way they never did for anything else. When Ethan was born, I decided, no, I convinced myself, that it was only right to leave my career aspirations behind. Raising a child was no small feat, and Daniel's career kept him busy, away on business trips, attending conferences, expanding his empire. So I stayed home. I raised Ethan, managed the house, and tended to Daniel's needs. My days became a blur of diapers, meals, school meetings, and supporting Daniel's growing success. I didn't resent it then. I believed it was what good wives did, what good mothers did. Now, sitting alone in this house that Daniel and I built in Charleston, Georgia, I realize how much of my life was shaped around others. It had been 3 years since Daniel passed. 3 long, lonely years. Ethan, my only son, visited less and less after his father died. Then came Madison. Madison, with her pristine smile and ambitious streak sharper than any blade I'd known. She was beautiful, no doubt smart, and calculated in ways that made me uneasy from the start. When Ethan married her, I told myself to give her a chance to let time smooth the edges. But time has a cruel way of revealing truths you wish would stay hidden. In the first year of their marriage, Ethan called, regularly stopped by for lunch, even helped me with grocery shopping now and then. By the second year, the calls dwindled, the visits grew brief and rare. By the third, I only heard from them when they needed something. A loan here, a little financial help there, favors cloaked in the language of family. Today marked the 3rd anniversary of Daniel's passing. I set the house as I always did. Polished the wooden banisters Daniel loved, wiped down the display cases of his beloved coin collection, brewed the same black tea he always sipped. The house was quiet, painfully so, until the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Ethan and Madison standing there, both impeccably dressed as though stepping out of a magazine cover. Mom, Ethan greeted me with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes, leaning in for a hug that felt too rehearsed. Madison followed suit, her arms looping around me just enough to seem polite. We settled in the living room, the walls still heavy with Daniel's presence, his photographs lining the mantels, his favorite books untouched in the corner shelves. Madison's gaze drifted to the coin display cabinets, lingering longer than necessary. I noticed it, tucked the observation away for later. Conversation started, as it always did. Surface-level updates about their lives. Madison's expanding business, Ethan's recent work projects. I nodded, asked the right questions, smiled in the right places. But there was something rehearsed about their tone, a script they had practiced on their way here. Madison leaned forward, a soft smile on her lips, her fingers lightly brushing the porcelain cup. Bethany, have you ever thought about how hard it must be to maintain this house? It's so big for just one person. There it was. I took a slow sip of tea, letting the words settle, allowing myself the quiet strength of not reacting too quickly. Ethan chimed in. It's just, after Dad passed, you've been handling everything on your own. It's too much for you, Mom. Madison and I were talking, and we think maybe it's time you considered moving somewhere more comfortable, safer. Like those lovely senior communities, Madison added quickly. There are great places with security, on-site healthcare, and people your age. You'd have companionship activities. Much more enriching than being stuck alone here. I listened. I smiled, though inside my heart thudded with an ache I couldn't quite explain. My home, this house, was filled with Daniel's memories, with decades of my sacrifices, my love, my life. To them, it was just too much square footage, too many dollars tied up in real estate. I'm perfectly fine here, I replied softly, looking straight at Ethan. This house doesn't feel empty to me. It feels lived in. It feels like home. I watched as a flicker of frustration danced in Madison's eyes before she replaced it with a sweet smile. Of course, Bethany, we're just thinking about your comfort. The conversation shifted after that, but the tone lingered. I felt it. The push, the subtle maneuvering. I knew my days of peaceful silence were about to be disrupted. Later that night, as I locked up the house, I walked past Daniel's coin cabinets. They glistened under the soft lights, little time capsules of history and passion. I rested my hand on the glass, breathing in deeply. This house held my story, my love, my sacrifices, and no amount of polite manipulation was going to take that away from me. Not now. Not ever. The next morning, the air in the house felt heavier than usual. I moved through the kitchen, performing the same old rituals. Boiling water, making a simple breakfast, but my heart was weighed down by something I couldn't quite name. The visit from Ethan and Madison the day before lingered in my mind like a stubborn shadow that refused to fade. I told myself to brush it off, to believe in the good intentions of my own child, but I'd lived long enough to recognize when something was off. By the afternoon, Ethan called again this time, suggesting they stop by for dinner. I agreed out of habit more than desire. They arrived with a bottle of overpriced wine, and that same polished, rehearsed friendliness that always made me feel like a background character in their lives. As I served dinner, Madison took every opportunity to compliment the house. Her eyes, however, kept drifting toward the hallway that led to Daniel's study. After dinner, the inevitable happened. The conversation took a sharp turn from the casual to the calculated. Madison leaned in with that perfect little smile of hers and started talking about her catering business, how it was on the cusp of something big, how all it needed was a little more investment to truly take off. You know, Bethany, she said, voice dipped in honey, it's always been inspiring how you and Daniel built your lives together. I've always admired Daniel's ability to see value where others couldn't, like this incredible coin collection of his. Each piece is history, right? It's amazing how something so small could be so valuable. I kept my face neutral, spooning a bit of mashed potatoes onto my plate. Madison's words were carefully chosen, spoken with just enough flattery to hide the sharp edge underneath. Ethan jumped in seamlessly, as though they had choreographed the entire performance before stepping into my house. "Mom, Madison's right. And speaking of value with the market the way it is, the house itself has appreciated a lot. I mean, have you thought about how much easier life could be if you sold it and downsized? That could free up so much capital for you to enjoy, for us to help you manage." The words were like a cold slap across the face. I had heard versions of this speech before, usually wrapped in the same packaging of concern for my well-being. I'd always shrugged it off. But today, there was an unmistakable undercurrent of desperation. This wasn't just about my comfort. This was about money. Their money. I pushed my plate back, folded my hands in my lap, and quietly said, "This house is not for sale." Ethan blinked, his smile faltering for a brief moment. Madison's fingers tightened around her wine glass before she composed herself. "Of course, Bethany, of course," she said quickly. "We were just thinking about your comfort." But I could feel it. The disappointment, the frustration, the simmering resentment they tried to mask behind their polished smiles. As the evening wore on, I noticed something else. Madison excused herself to the bathroom but took far too long to return. She said she got lost looking for the guest towels, but I knew my house and I knew where she had gone. The door to Daniel's study was ajar when it had been firmly closed earlier. I said nothing, but my heart hardened. Later that night, after they had left with their empty promises of returning soon, I stood in front of Daniel's study door, the familiar oak panel now feeling like a barricade between me and the painful truth. I pushed the door open and inhaled the faint, comforting scent of old books and polished wood. The study was exactly as Daniel had left it, everything in its place, at least at first glance. I walked past the desk and to the glass display cabinets where his prized coin collection rested. I ran my fingers lightly along the edges of the glass before unlocking the cabinet and pulling open the small wooden drawer that housed the most valuable pieces. My stomach dropped. The arrangement was wrong. Daniel had always been meticulous. Each coin was placed carefully according to period and value, but now several display cases had been shifted, and one of the leather coin pouches was resting awkwardly to the side, its clasps slightly loosened. With trembling hands, I checked the contents. Some coins were still there, but something felt missing. I reached for the small box Daniel had kept for his highest value coins, those he referred to as the crown jewels of his collection. I opened it and felt my breath catch. The velvet slots were disrupted, and the most important piece, Daniel's rarest coin, the ancient gold coin depicting Athena, was gone. I felt the blood drain from my face. I stood there clutching the empty case, the magnitude of the betrayal sinking into my bones. This wasn't about concern for me. This wasn't about wanting me to be comfortable or happy. This was about what I owned, what they thought they could quietly siphon away under the guise of love and family. For the first time in my life, the ache of disappointment weighed heavier than grief. I realized the distance between me and my son was far greater than a few forgotten phone calls or missed holidays. It was carved by greed and facilitated by the woman he married. That night I barely slept. My thoughts ran wild questions, chasing one another without rest. How many other things had gone missing? How long had they been planning this? I had no immediate answers, but one thing had become painfully clear. I could no longer pretend to be blind. My instincts were screaming, and for once I decided to listen. This house held my memories, but it also held the truth. And starting the next morning I would find it, every last piece of it. A week passed, though it felt like an eternity. Every morning I tried to carry on with my routines, watering the plants, feeding the neighborhood birds, organizing the kitchen cabinets. But my mind was somewhere else entirely. Something inside me refused to settle. A quiet storm brewed beneath my skin, demanding answers I was no longer willing to ignore. It was the third morning after Ethan and Madison's visit when I returned to Daniel's study, this time determined to examine every inch of his cherished collection. I carefully unlocked the glass cabinet again, trying to steady my breathing as I slid out each drawer, counting the coins, inspecting their arrangement. I had memorized the layout over the years, not because I had any interest in the monetary value, but because these coins had been part of Daniel's joy, a legacy built not on wealth, but on stories and history. And then I noticed it, an empty slot where the most valuable piece had always been kept. Daniel's rarest coin. The one he spoke of with a sparkle in his eyes. The coin he had bid on during a prestigious auction in Geneva. A gleaming gold coin from ancient Greece, depicting the face of Athena, goddess of wisdom. It was gone. My hands turned cold, my knees nearly gave way beneath me. I closed the cabinet, locked it, and sat down heavily in Daniel's chair. All the pieces started to fall into place. Madison's lingering gaze on the cabinet, her unexplained absence during dinner, the sudden push to sell the house and move me out. I pressed my fingers to my temples, trying to process what this meant. I couldn't make accusations without certainty. I needed someone who would understand, someone who had stood beside me through life's hardest storms. There was only one person I trusted enough to speak these thoughts aloud. Edith Brooks. Edith had been my friend since the early days of marriage. She had seen me through motherhood, widowhood, and everything in between. I picked up the phone and called her. The familiar warmth in her voice immediately calmed my rattled nerves. I told her everything, how Ethan and Madison had come over, the manipulative talk about the house, the strange energy I couldn't shake, and finally the missing coin. Edith listened quietly, only interjecting when necessary, as she always did. When I finished, there was a long silence before she spoke, her voice firm and unwavering. "Bethany, it's them. You know it deep down. Your instincts have been trying to tell you for a while now, and this is the proof. Ethan and Madison didn't come over to check on you. They came to take what they could." Hearing someone else say it out loud made it more real, more painful. My own child, my son, had crossed a line I never thought he would. But I needed more than a gut feeling. I needed facts. Edith, always the practical one, encouraged me to act smart. "Track it down," she said. "That coin isn't something you can just sell on a street corner. They'll have to go to someone reputable, someone Daniel would have known." Her words made sense. Daniel had a trusted circle of collectors and dealers in Charleston. One name stood out above all others: Lucas Bennett. Lucas had been a close acquaintance of Daniel's, often invited over for afternoon discussions about rare finds and antique markets. If anyone would know about the coin's whereabouts, it would be him. I took a deep breath, steeled my nerves, and searched for Lucas's business card in the drawer where Daniel had kept all his contacts. The card was old but intact, the ink slightly faded, but the number still legible. My fingers trembled slightly as I dialed. Lucas answered after the third ring, his voice as warm and professional as I remembered. I introduced myself, and he immediately softened, expressing his condolences once again about Daniel's passing. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. I asked if anyone had recently approached him regarding a coin, a very specific, very rare gold Athena. There was a brief pause on the other end before Lucas spoke, his tone shifting from friendly to cautious. "Bethany, I wasn't sure if I should reach out to you. I've been meaning to, actually." My stomach nodded. I asked him directly, my voice barely a whisper. "Did Ethan bring you the coin?" Lucas exhaled, confirming what I feared. "Yes, Ethan and his wife Madison stopped by a few days ago. They said the coin was part of Daniel's estate and that you had given them permission to sell it on behalf of the family." I closed my eyes, feeling a fresh wave of betrayal crash over me. My son had lied not only to me, but to someone who had known our family for decades. Lucas continued. "But something didn't sit right with me, Bethany. Daniel was very clear about that coin. He once told me it would never leave the family unless it was your decision. That's why I stalled. I told them I needed to authenticate it to verify its provenance before proceeding with any sale. The coin is currently locked in my office safe. Tears pricked my eyes, a complex mixture of heartbreak and relief. Relief that at least someone had respected Daniel's wishes. Relief that the coin hadn't yet been lost to some nameless buyer. Lucas's voice softened. Bethany, I've known you and Daniel too long to get involved in something that doesn't feel right. I suspected Ethan wasn't telling me the full story. That's why I haven't processed the sale. I was waiting for your call. I swallowed hard, grateful for Lucas's integrity. After a moment, I said, Please don't release the coin to them. I'll come to see you tomorrow and I'll explain everything. He agreed without hesitation, promising to safeguard the coin until I arrived. After hanging up, I sat in the quiet of Daniel's study, the walls around me thick with memories. I thought about my son, the little boy who once ran into my arms after falling off his bicycle, who used to beg me for one more bedtime story, who used to look at me with pure love in his eyes. Somewhere along the way, that boy had disappeared, replaced by a man driven by greed, influenced by a woman who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle between her and my husband's wealth. For the first time in years, I felt the walls of my home shift. It was no longer just a place of memories. It was the scene of a crime, the center of a betrayal I could no longer ignore. But I also felt something else. A quiet, simmering strength. They thought I was old and fragile, easy to manipulate and easier to discard. They had forgotten I had built this home, that I had stood by Daniel's side through decades of triumphs and tragedies, and that the fire within me, though dimmed, had never gone out. Tomorrow I would go to Lucas. Tomorrow I would get back what was rightfully mine, and soon after I would get back something far more valuable, my dignity, my power, and the control over my own life. They had underestimated me. That would be their greatest mistake. The next morning, I rose early, determined to reclaim not just Daniel's coin, but also the dignity that had slowly been stripped from me. The streets of Charleston were already busy by the time I made my way downtown to Lucas Bennett's office. I had always liked Lucas. He had a quiet manner about him, the kind that commanded respect without ever having to demand it. Daniel had trusted him, and in that moment I was grateful that I could too. Lucas greeted me with a gentle smile when I arrived, leading me through his modest office, lined with wooden display cases and velvet-lined drawers. Coins from all over the world gleamed under the soft lighting, each holding stories of forgotten empires and vanished currencies. We bypassed them all, heading straight to his private office in the back, where a steel safe stood, tucked behind a bookshelf. "I've been waiting for you, Bethany," Lucas said as he keyed in the code and unlocked the safe. He retrieved a small leather-bound box, the kind Daniel used for his highest-value pieces. As he placed it on the desk and unfastened the latch, I felt my chest tighten. Inside, the Athena coin rested, gleaming with an otherworldly golden glow. I swallowed hard, both from relief that it was safely back in trusted hands and from the quiet fury that it had been stolen from me. Lucas handled the coin carefully, using white gloves. "There's something you need to see," he said quietly. I leaned forward, studying the coin as he gently flipped it over. To any untrained eye, it appeared to be a standard antique coin, but Lucas pressed a tiny point on the edge, a mechanism so subtle I never would have noticed it. With a soft click, the coin separated, revealing a hidden compartment embedded within the thick gold. My breath hitched in my throat as I leaned in closer. Inside the compartment lay a delicate yellowed photograph carefully folded, and a tiny ornate key with a slender neck and a rounded head engraved with unfamiliar markings. Lucas set both items gently on the velvet lining before closing the coin back to its original state. I reached out with hesitant fingers, picking up the photograph first. It was a small black and white image, slightly faded by time. A young woman stared back at me, her features soft, yet striking, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders. Her eyes held a familiarity I couldn't quite place, a quiet strength, And perhaps something more, something hidden. On the back of the photograph, Daniel's handwriting stared back at me, elegantly cursive, yet weighted with emotion. Eleanor Carter, 1964. Forgive me. My hand trembled slightly as I traced the words. A name I had never heard before. A year that preceded my entire life with Daniel. My mind spun trying to piece together who this woman was and why Daniel had hidden her picture in the very heart of his prized possession. Lucas watched me with quiet understanding before speaking. I don't pretend to know what Daniel's intentions were, but this wasn't just about money. Coins don't carry photographs unless they're hiding something far more personal. I knotted my throat, tightening as I picked up the tiny key. It was heavier than it looked, cold to the touch. Its head bore a series of intricate symbols, almost like a family crest or an old monogram. I had never seen anything like it in our house. Lucas continued, his voice calm but firm. Ethan told me you gave them permission to sell the coin, but I knew better. Daniel told me once that the Athena coin was never to leave your hands unless you made that decision. That's why I stalled. I was grateful beyond words for Lucas's integrity. Had it been any other dealer, that coin could have been long gone by now, sold to some faceless collector, and I would have never known the truth hidden inside it. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Lucas, thank you for protecting this. I had no idea Daniel kept secrets like this. He gave me a sympathetic smile. Secrets tend to come to light when we least expect them. I cradled the coin box in my lap, clutching the photograph and key in my hands. My thoughts ran wild. Eleanor Carter, 1964. Forgive me. Who was she? What did Daniel do that required forgiveness? And most importantly, what did this key open? Lucas didn't pry further, offering only, "If you want me to help track down more information, just say the word." I shook my head gently. I need to figure out what's in my own home first. By the time I left Lucas's office, the box safely tucked inside my handbag, my heart felt heavier than it had in years. Betrayal was one thing. Having my son lie to my face trying to sell something so meaningful without my consent. But discovering my husband of over 5 decades had kept such a profound secret felt like an entirely different kind of wound. Back home, I walked through the door of my house with new eyes. Every room felt different, every photograph on the walls, every book on the shelves. I had built my life around Daniel, and yet there was a piece of him I had never known. I took the key and the photograph up to Daniel's study, sitting in the leather chair where he had spent countless evenings cataloging coins, scribbling in his notebooks, reading ancient history texts. I glanced around the room, suddenly hyper-aware of all the places Daniel could have hidden more than just coins. The key was old, unique, and likely tied to something significant. Perhaps a box, a drawer, maybe even a hidden compartment in the house. I traced my fingers along the edges of the heavy oak desk, recalling Daniel's meticulousness, his eye for detail. He was the kind of man who planned everything, who didn't do anything without a reason. Something was waiting for me inside these walls. Something Daniel had chosen to hide, perhaps to protect me. Perhaps to protect himself. And whatever it was, I had no doubt Ethan and Madison were hoping I'd never find it. But they were wrong. This wasn't just about the coin anymore. This was about finding the whole truth. Clutching the key tighter, I made a quiet promise to myself. I would uncover everything Daniel had hidden. I would learn the story behind Eleanor Carter and what those years meant. And I would make sure that no one, not Ethan, not Madison, would erase Daniel's true legacy or manipulate me any longer. The time of silence was over. Now it was my turn to uncover the secrets buried within this house, to protect what was left of my dignity, and to reclaim the pieces of my life stolen by betrayal and deceit. The house had always been my refuge, a shelter built on decades of love, sacrifice, and silent devotion. But that afternoon, standing in Daniel's study with the hidden key clutched tightly in my palm, it felt different. As though the walls themselves had been holding back a truth I had never been allowed to see. I walked slowly around the room, feeling the weight of secrets pressing down from every corner. Daniel was a man of precision, of quiet complexity. I knew if there was more to discover, it wouldn't be obvious. He would have hidden it where only someone who truly knew him would ever think to look. I traced my fingers along the shelves, feeling for any irregularities. Every book seemed in its place, every antique perfectly arranged. My gaze drifted to the paintings lining the walls. Seascapes, old portraits, landscapes from places Daniel had once visited. I remembered how particular he had been about their arrangement, how he refused to let anyone move them, not even me. That was where I would start. I moved to the largest painting, a serene coastal view that had hung directly above his desk for as long as I could remember. I carefully lifted it from its hook, bracing for nothing more than dust and drywall. But my fingertips caught on something peculiar, a thin indentation running along the outline of the wall where the painting had hung. My heart quickened. Using the key as a guide, I pressed gently along the edges, feeling for any movement. There on the right side, my thumb sank slightly into a groove. A quiet click echoed through the otherwise silent room, and a rectangular section of the wall gave way, revealing a small recessed compartment. My breath caught. I had lived in this house for over 40 years, cleaned this room every week, yet I had never known this place existed. Inside the hidden space was a weathered leather folder tied with a faded blue ribbon. My hands trembled as I pulled it free, setting it down carefully on Daniel's desk. I untied the ribbon and opened the folder, revealing a stack of papers, aged by time but meticulously organized. At the very top lay a letter addressed to me in Daniel's unmistakable handwriting. My throat tightened as I read the opening lines. My dearest Bethany, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer by your side. There are truths I never had the courage to tell you while I was alive, not because I did not love you, but because I did. I feared losing the life we built together. I pressed the letter to my chest for a brief moment, willing my heart to stay steady. I knew whatever came next would change everything. Beneath the letter were legal documents stamped and notarized, a last will and testament dated nearly 6 months before Daniel's death. My eyes scanned the lines, each sentence cutting deeper than the last. Daniel had revised his will without ever telling me. This version was drastically different from the one I had been presented after his funeral. I had believed everything had been divided equally between me and Ethan, with small charitable donations sprinkled in for goodwill. But this will told a very different story. Daniel had left me the house, our personal savings, and several accounts to ensure my comfort for the rest of my life. But the majority of the corporate assets, the ownership of Wallace Analytics, was no longer destined to stay within Ethan's hands. 30% of the company's shares were assigned to someone I had never heard of, Emma Carter. Only 20% remained in Ethan's name. I sat back in the chair, my pulse racing. I turned the next page and found a detailed dossier attached. Photographs, birth certificates, letters from lawyers, and records of wire transfers spanning decades. At the center of it all was a name, Emma Carter. Daniel's letter continued, and I forced myself to read every word. Emma is my daughter, born long before I ever met you, before I was the man you knew, before I became someone worthy of building a family. I failed her in ways I could never correct, but I tried to do right by her quietly. I supported her from a distance, watched her grow into a remarkable woman. I never told you because I couldn't bear the thought of changing how you looked at me, at us. But Emma deserves to be recognized. She is part of my legacy, as are you. My vision blurred the letters swimming on the page. A daughter. Daniel had a daughter, and he had hidden it from me for decades. Everything I thought I knew about my marriage, about my life, shifted in that moment. I pressed my trembling hands against the desk, fighting the storm that threatened to drown me. A daughter I had never known existed. A daughter who had been deliberately excluded from the family narrative, from Ethan's narrative. A daughter Daniel had tried to quietly include in his final wishes. I thumbed through more pages. There were records of Daniel's meetings with his attorney correspondence, ensuring Emma's well-being photographs of her through different stages of life, graduation wedding her own children, a life that had unfolded parallel to mine hidden in plain sight. I reached the final page of the will. A note in Daniel's handwriting stood out, scribbled in the margin. Athena remains yours, Bethany. Emma receives what is fair. Ethan will receive enough to build his own life. This is what balance looks like. It took every ounce of strength not to cry. Not out of anger, though, there was plenty of that, but from the sheer magnitude of the deception. I thought of Ethan, of his entitlement, of his greedy, manipulative tone every time we spoke about finances. I thought of Madison's false smiles, her calculated words. And I thought of this woman Emma, a stranger by name but connected by blood, who had never asked for anything, and yet had been left what was rightfully hers. I placed the letter back into the folder, carefully closing it. My thoughts shifted from grief to clarity. Daniel had made his final decision. He had tried in his own flawed way to make amends before it was too late. Ethan had tried to erase that final act of fairness. Madison had stood by him, likely even encouraged it. No more. This house may have stood tall all these years, but the cracks had run deep. Cracks built from silence, from secrets, from greed. I would not allow the rot to fester any longer. I locked the folder away in my personal safe, securing the evidence I would need for what was to come. Ethan had crossed a line. Madison had crossed it with him. They had underestimated me, the quiet woman who had spent decades pouring her life into this family. But they forgot, in their arrogance, that quiet did not mean weak. For the first time in years, I felt an unfamiliar surge of purpose. I would honor Daniel's true wishes. I would defend Emma's rightful place, and I would take back control over the life they all thought I had given up. The walls of this house had hidden too much for too long. It was time for the truth to breathe again. I sat in Daniel's study long after the sun dipped below the horizon, shadows crawling across the walls that had once felt like home. The folder lay closed in front of me, yet the weight of its contents pressed heavily on my chest. I thought I had known my husband. I thought I had understood the life we built together. And now, after more than 5 decades of marriage, I realized there had been entire chapters I was never allowed to read. A daughter, a hidden child, Emma Carter. A name that was nothing more than a stranger to me, yet her existence had rewritten the foundation of my marriage in mere moments. Grief crept back into my bones, but this grief was different. This wasn't the sharp stabbing pain I had felt when Daniel passed away. No, this was deeper, heavier. A sorrow that wrapped itself around my soul like iron chains. I mourned the man I thought I knew the truth. I thought I carried. I mourned the betrayal of silence, the years of companionship now laced with deception. And worst of all, I mourned for myself, the woman who had poured everything into this family, only to be repaid with hidden truths and quiet betrayals. But amidst the ache, another emotion stirred. Disappointment. Not just in Daniel, but in Ethan, my only son, flesh of my flesh. I had raised him with love, with values, with sacrifice. I had stayed up through his sleepless nights, cheered him through every milestone, stood by him through every heartbreak. I had given him every piece of me. And this was how he repaid me. By stealing from me, by lying to me, by conspiring behind my back for personal gain. I had been naive for far too long. Blinded by love, dulled by routine, comforted by tradition. But now the scales had fallen from my eyes, and what I saw was ugly. I pressed my palms flat on Daniel's desk, steadying myself. My heart ached, but my mind was clear. I wouldn't let this betrayal define me. I wouldn't let greed dictate the legacy Daniel left behind. With a deep breath, I stood gathering the folder and tucking it safely into my handbag. There was only one person I could trust to guide me through this. Grant Turner. Grant had been Daniel's lawyer for more than 20 years. He was meticulous, fair, and perhaps more importantly, had always respected me in ways others in Daniel's world had not. He knew Daniel better than most, both as a businessman and a man. The next morning, I called Grant's office. His assistant, a sweet young woman named Caroline, scheduled me in for that afternoon. I dressed purposefully. Choosing a simple navy dress Daniel had always admired, brushed my hair back neatly, and stood tall. I may have been grieving, but I refused to appear broken. Grant's office was situated in the heart of Charleston's historic district, a red brick building that had weathered time just as I had. When I arrived, Grant welcomed me with his usual calm demeanor, his kind eyes reflecting curiosity and concern. We exchanged pleasantries, but I wasted no time in presenting the folder. His brows furrowed as he flipped through the documents, his expression shifting from confusion to shock to grim understanding. He read Daniel's handwritten letter, the notarized will, the supporting documents about Emma. Silence lingered in the room, punctuated only by the occasional shuffle of papers. Finally, he closed the folder and leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled thoughtfully beneath his chin. "Bethany," he began slowly, this changes everything. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I need to know if this will is legitimate, if it can override the version we read after Daniel passed. Grant didn't hesitate. "It's absolutely legitimate. The signatures are valid. Lucas Bennett is a recognized witness, and the notary present is well regarded. The date supersedes the previous will. Legally, this is Daniel's final binding testament." His words settled over me like a quiet storm. It was real. It wasn't just some forgotten piece of paper. It was Daniel's final intention. I had been living a lie, and worse, Ethan had known about it. He had tried to bury it by stealing the key to this truth, by attempting to sell Daniel's prized coin, by erasing Emma's rightful place in the family legacy. Grant's eyes softened as he watched me grapple with the realization. "What do you want to do, Bethany?" It was a simple question, but it carried the weight of everything I had endured. I took a steadying breath, lifting my chin. "I want Daniel's true wishes honored. I want Emma to have what Daniel left for her, and I want Ethan to be held accountable for what he's done. I won't be manipulated anymore." Grant nodded approvingly. "That's the right decision. Ethan and Madison have clearly acted in bad faith. This new will allows us to reclaim the estate allocations and protect your rights." He explained the process to me, how the estate proceedings could be reopened, how the fraudulent actions of Ethan could be exposed, how the property and assets would need to be redistributed according to the legitimate will. It would be a battle, no doubt. Ethan would resist, Madison would fight, but the law was on my side. "We'll need to notify Ethan of this discovery," Grant said, "and I'll be filing motions with the probate court to validate this will." "Pato." A bitter laugh escaped my lips, laced with irony. "He won't take this well." Grant gave me a sympathetic smile. "He doesn't have to. You've spent your life sacrificing for others, Bethany. This time you're standing up for yourself. You're doing what's right, not just for you, but for Daniel's memory and for Emma." Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them away. I had cried enough. My heart had been shattered, but my resolve was stronger than it had ever been. Before I left, Grant assured me he would begin the legal process immediately. As I walked out of his office, clutching my purse a little tighter, I felt a shift within me. For too long, I had allowed others to dictate my worth, my choices, my legacy. No more. I was done being the quiet, accommodating woman in the background. I returned home, the familiar walls greeting me with a silence that no longer felt oppressive but empowering. I placed the folder in a safe place, poured myself a cup of tea, and sat by the window, letting the sunlight wash over me. Ethan and Madison thought they could steal my future, rewrite Daniel's legacy, and erase Emma's existence. They thought I would be too old, too broken, too weak to fight back. They were wrong. I was Bethany Wallace, and I was reclaiming my life, piece by piece, truth by truth. The past may have been written in secrets, but the future would be written by me. I didn't sleep the night before. I lay awake listening to the clock tick steadily in the silence of the house that had sheltered me for decades. My mind turned over every word I would say, every emotion I would refuse to let control me. The betrayal was too deep to deny, the lies too obvious to excuse. I wasn't going to beg for respect anymore. I was going to demand it, or at the very least draw my line in the sand. By mid-morning, I had called Ethan and Madison, asking them to come over for an important discussion. My tone left no room for excuses. Madison had attempted to reschedule, citing some last-minute catering engagement, but I cut her off firm and cold. "This isn't optional," I said simply. "You both need to be here tonight." 7 o'clock sharp. The doorbell rang. For a brief moment, I stood at the door, my hand resting on the knob, letting myself absorb the enormity of what I was about to do. Then, with a steady breath, I opened the door. Ethan was standing there with his usual forced smile, his eyes wary. Madison, pristine as ever, stepped in beside him, clutching a designer handbag, and wearing a look that hovered between politeness and irritation. I greeted them without warmth, gesturing for them to follow me to the living room. I had prepared everything in advance. The documents were stacked neatly on the coffee table. The stolen Athena coin, safely returned from Lucas, sat in its velvet box. The photograph of Emma, the tiny key, Daniel's handwritten letter. Everything laid bare and ready. We sat in a silence that stretched too long before I finally broke it. "I know everything." The words fell between us like a weight. Ethan's smile faltered, his hands gripping the arms of the chair a little too tightly. Madison blinked rapidly, tilting her head in feigned confusion. "Mom," Ethan began, the charm slipping into his voice. "I'm not sure what you mean." I cut him off with a calm, unflinching voice. "Don't lie to me, Ethan. Not anymore." Madison recovered faster, her tone light and sweet. "Bethany, we've always been upfront with you. We care about you. We only want what's best for you." I let out a quiet laugh, bitter and low. "What's best for me? Is that what you call stealing from me?" Ethan's face tightened, his smile now gone entirely. "Mom, I think you've misunderstood." I leaned forward, my hands resting on the folder. "No, Ethan. You think I'm too old, too naive, too sentimental to see through your lies. You think you could take what you wanted and I would be none the wiser. But you underestimated me." I opened the folder and pulled out the first item. The coin box. "Do you recognize this?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. Madison's gaze flicked to the box, then back to me, her smile stiffening. "This was taken from Daniel's study without my knowledge. You tried to sell it to Lucas Bennett, lying to him about my permission. He didn't believe you." Ethan opened his mouth, but I held up a hand, silencing him. I continued, lifting the key from the table and setting it beside the coin. Inside this coin was a hidden key. It opened a compartment in your father's study that I didn't even know existed. Behind it, I found Daniel's final will, along with letters, documents, and photographs you both never wanted me to see. Madison swallowed visibly, her polished mask starting to crack. Ethan's foot bounced anxiously against the floor, a nervous tic I'd seen since he was a child. I pulled out the letter, Daniel's handwriting unmistakable, and placed it atop the stack. I found out about Emma. I found out about Daniel's revised will. I found out how you both tried to hide her existence and take more than your rightful share. You were willing to erase her, to erase Daniel's last wishes, just so you could get your hands on money you didn't earn. Ethan's face turned red, his breathing sharper. "Mom, you don't understand. Don't you dare," I said, my voice rising for the first time. "Don't you dare tell me I don't understand." I looked him straight in the eye, the boy I had raised, the man I now barely recognized. "I understand perfectly. I gave you everything I could. I sacrificed my dreams, my time, my energy to raise you. I stood by you when you failed, cheered for you when you succeeded. I defended you when others criticized you. I loved you without conditions, and you paid me back by stealing from me." Ethan stood up abruptly, his fists clenched. "I was protecting what's ours. You don't know this woman, this Emma. You don't know what lies Daniel told you or what manipulation she used. Madison placed a hand on his arm, trying to soothe him, but I stood too. Enough, I said firmly. Daniel wasn't perfect, but his last will was clear. He wanted Emma to have her share, and I will make sure she gets it. You tried to erase her existence because you saw her as a threat to your entitlement. Ethan's nostrils flared, his words hot and venomous. She's not part of this family. I met his anger with a coldness I didn't know I possessed. Blood says otherwise. Daniel's will says otherwise. And if you think you can shout your way into convincing me otherwise, you're mistaken. I straightened my shoulders, feeling the clarity of purpose settle into my bones. The house will be sold. The assets will be distributed according to Daniel's real will. I've already spoken to Grant Turner. The legal process has begun, and your father's wishes will be honored whether you like it or not. Madison's voice trembled for the first time. Bethany, surely there's a way to negotiate. We're family. I gave her a look so sharp it cut through her rehearsed sweetness. You treated me like a burden. You treated Daniel's legacy like a payday. You treated Emma's existence like an inconvenience. I don't owe you anything. Ethan's rage sputtered, unable to form coherent arguments, his jaw working uselessly. He pointed toward the documents. This isn't over. We'll fight this. You can't just rewrite everything. I let out a steady breath. I'm not rewriting anything. I'm correcting what you tried to destroy. Daniel rewrote his will. I'm just making sure it's enforced. The room was heavy, the finality of my words sinking in. Ethan looked at me not as his mother, but as an obstacle. And for the first time, I didn't shrink from it. I pointed to the door. You can leave now. Ethan hesitated, his chest rising and falling rapidly, but Madison tugged on his arm, sensing the futility of the moment. Without another word, they walked out of the house. As the door clicked shut behind them, I stood in the silence, the first true silence I had felt in years. Not the silence of loneliness, but the silence of freedom. For the first time, I stood on my own side. For the first time, I wasn't surviving for others. I was living for myself and honoring the truth. Daniel's secrets were out. The lies had been exposed. And now the house that had seen too much betrayal would finally witness justice. I didn't feel broken. I felt awake, and I was just getting started. The morning after confronting Ethan and Madison, I sat quietly at my kitchen table sipping my tea as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains. But the house no longer gave me comfort. Every corner, every hallway, every room now echoed with memories tainted by betrayal and secrets. I stared out into the backyard Daniel had so carefully maintained and realized something I should have seen long ago. This house had stopped being my home the day the people I loved most decided to manipulate and discard me. It was nothing more than a shell filled with fading photographs and hollow promises. Before I could second-guess myself, I picked up the phone and called Grant Turner. His calm, reassuring voice was just what I needed to steady my heart. We arranged a meeting for that afternoon. When I arrived at his office, Grant was already prepared. He had drawn up the paperwork needed to move forward with enforcing Daniel's true will, protecting my rights, and ensuring Emma received what was rightfully hers. We discussed the possibility, the likelihood, that Ethan would attempt to block the process. Grant didn't mince words. Bethany, he said gently, if Ethan pushes back, we'll counter with a formal lawsuit. We'll take this to court if we must. You have every legal ground to stand on. I nodded, feeling a steely resolve take root within me. I wasn't afraid of a courtroom. I wasn't afraid of Ethan's tantrums or Madison's manipulation. Not anymore. For too long I had been silenced by love, blinded by trust, and crippled by guilt. That ended now. Grant continued. I've also drafted a letter to be sent to Emma Carter. We'll inform her of Daniel's will, her inheritance, and her right to be part of this estate. Would you like me to reach out on your behalf? The thought of Emma, Daniel's hidden daughter, sent a shiver through me, but not one of anger. Curiosity, perhaps. Maybe even compassion. She had never asked for anything, never intruded, and yet she had been denied so much. I took a moment before answering, then said firmly, "Yes. Please contact her. She deserves to know the truth." Grant nodded, satisfied, then shifted the conversation to the matter of my home. "Have you given thought to what you'd like to do with the house?" I didn't hesitate. "I'm going to sell it." Grant raised an eyebrow, but I continued before he could question it. "This house holds too much pain now. I've spent my whole life here raising a son who no longer respects me, building a life that was partly a lie. I don't want these walls around me anymore. I want peace. I want simplicity." There was a relief in saying it out loud, a release of all the weight I had carried on my shoulders for far too long. Grant understood. He promised to put me in touch with a reputable real estate agent and oversee the sale personally to ensure Ethan couldn't interfere. He reminded me that I had full legal rights to make these decisions without consulting anyone. I thanked him, feeling a strange sense of lightness take root in my chest. The next few days passed in a blur of action. I met with a real estate agent, walked her through the house, and signed the initial paperwork. The house I had spent decades caring for would soon belong to someone else, and surprisingly, I felt no sadness, only freedom. Ethan, of course, didn't take the news well. When he learned about the sale through Grant, he called me in a rage, his voice booming through the receiver. "Mom, you can't do this," he shouted. "This is our family home. Dad built this for us." I stayed calm, my voice even. "Your father built this house for our family, yes? And I was part of that family long before you were born. I have every right to decide what happens to it." He was livid, accusing me of turning my back on him, of allowing some stranger, Emma, to come in and take what belonged to him. "This house," I said, "slowly belongs to me. The company shares belong to Emma and you according to your father's wishes. And I will honor those wishes. You won't bully me into changing that." His anger only intensified. "I will contest this in court. You'll regret siding with some woman who meant nothing to you." But I was no longer that woman who backed down to his shouting, who softened in the face of his temper. "You will do what you feel you must, Ethan. And I will do the same." I hung up the phone with a steady hand and a quiet heart. Later that evening, Madison showed up unannounced. She rang the doorbell and stood there with carefully constructed sadness in her eyes, a softer tone in her voice. "Bethany, can we talk?" I invited her in out of habit rather than warmth. She sat at the kitchen table, hands clasped, speaking in a measured, pleading tone. "Look, I understand things have gotten complicated," she began. "But Ethan loves you. He's just stressed. We've made mistakes, sure, but we're family." I listened without interrupting, watching her weave half-truths and empty apologies into a performance I knew was rehearsed. When she finished, I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. "You and Ethan didn't just make a mistake. You stole from me. You lied to me. You tried to erase someone from existence because it threatened your bank account." Her eyes widened, her mouth opening to object, but I cut her off. "I have no interest in fixing this relationship. I have no obligation to forgive what you both have done. I'm done being the mother-in-law you can manipulate and guilt into submission." Madison's composure cracked. Her posture stiffened, her lips pursed. "Bethany, we can come to some sort of arrangement." "You don't have to cut us out completely." I smiled politely, standing to signal the end of our conversation. "You're right, I don't have to cut you out completely. But I choose to." Madison left soon after, a storm cloud in designer heels, and I felt no guilt watching her walk away. By the end of the week, the real estate listing went live. I began sorting through my belongings, packing only the things that brought me joy, and leaving behind everything that tethered me to a life I no longer wanted. I arranged for a cozy apartment in the heart of the city, close to parks, bookstores, and cafes. It wasn't big, but it was exactly what I needed. A fresh start. Every box I packed, every decision I made strengthened me. I was finally reclaiming my life. I wasn't just a widow or a forgotten mother. I wasn't an afterthought in someone else's story. I was Bethany Wallace, woman of independence, of clarity, of quiet but unshakable strength. And for the first time in decades, I was free. The email came on a quiet morning. I was sitting by the window sipping my usual cup of Earl Grey, watching the first signs of spring begin to soften the edges of winter. The email notification chimed softly from my tablet, and I almost ignored it, assuming it was another notification about the house listing or an automated update from the lawyer. But when I glanced at the screen, I saw the name I had been quietly thinking about ever since I sent that letter through Grant, Emma Carter. My heart thudded softly as I opened the message, unsure of what to expect. I had told myself that I would be prepared for any reaction, but I knew that wasn't quite true. I was human after all, and this was not just any reply. It was from Daniel's daughter, a woman who existed in the shadows of my life, unknown to me until just a few weeks prior. Her words were simple, graceful, and unexpectedly kind. She thanked me for reaching out, expressed her condolences for Daniel's passing, and politely acknowledged that she had been unaware of the details surrounding the inheritance until now. She explained with a level of humility I wasn't expecting that she had never intended to claim anything from the Wallace family, that she had always respected her late father's choices, even if those choices had excluded her from the life he built with me. She didn't speak with bitterness or entitlement. There was no hidden anger, no demands, no resentment in her words. Instead, there was honesty, gentle, sincere honesty from someone who seemed to have come to terms with the complicated hand life had dealt her. I read her email 3 times, letting each sentence settle within me. I had braced myself for hostility, for awkwardness, for a defensive stranger on the other end of this exchange. But what I received instead was warmth, understanding, and something I hadn't expected at all: peace. I took my time crafting a response. I told Emma about Daniel's love for history, his obsession with coins, the little things he did around the house that used to drive me crazy but now made me smile. I was honest about the pain I'd felt discovering the truth so late, but I also admitted that part of me felt strangely comforted, knowing Daniel had tried in his own flawed way to make things right before his passing. We exchanged more emails in the following days. Short notes at first, then longer letters where we spoke about simple things: her children, my garden, the books we liked to read. I learned that Emma was a teacher, that she lived in Oregon with her husband, and 2 children, that she lived a modest content life far from the entitlement Ethan had displayed. She told me about her mother, about how Daniel had supported them quietly over the years but never intervened. She said she never expected more than that, and certainly never expected to be part of our world. There was something deeply grounding about our exchanges. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't thinking about courtrooms or financial settlements. I wasn't thinking about Ethan's shouting or Madison's rehearsed apologies. I was simply talking to another woman who, like me, had navigated the unpredictable waters of life with quiet resilience. Grant kept me updated on the legal proceedings, on the progress of the house sale, on the motions being filed to protect Daniel's final will. But in the quiet corners of my days, it was Emma's messages that brought me a different kind of solace. One that reminded me there were still good people in this world, still relationships worth nurturing even if they came from the most unexpected places. I didn't rush to make plans to meet her. Something about the slow unfolding of our connection felt right. It wasn't forced, it wasn't artificial. It was simple correspondence built on mutual respect and shared loss. There was no need to complicate it with expectations or awkward introductions, not yet. One evening I sat on my porch watching the sky turn a soft hue of lavender and peach. I thought about all the changes happening around me. The house soon to be sold no longer felt like my cage, but simply a place I had outgrown. Ethan's anger no longer weighed me down. It was his burden to carry, not mine. And Daniel, for all his faults, had left behind one final act of honesty, even if it took a hidden coin to reveal it. I realized then that I felt lighter, not completely healed, not untouched by the betrayals I'd endured, but freer. freer than I had been in years. I had reclaimed my dignity, my independence, and found an unexpected connection along the way. I wasn't sure what the future would hold. I didn't know if I'd ever meet Emma face to face or if we'd one day sit down over coffee and swap stories about the man who had quietly connected our lives. But for the first time, I wasn't consumed by what I didn't know. I wasn't rushing to fix what couldn't be undone. I was learning to be content with the quiet, to trust the gentle unfolding of things beyond my control. As the stars began to dot the evening sky, I smiled to myself, knowing that sometimes freedom doesn't come from grand gestures or dramatic endings. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a simple email from a stranger who shares your history. Sometimes it grows in the silence after the storm, in the quiet choice to let go of anger and embrace peace. For the first time in a long while, I felt no need to look back, and it felt good. The house was quieter than usual in those final days, but it was no longer the suffocating silence I had grown accustomed to. It was a calm, expectant quiet, the kind that comes before a new chapter begins. I moved through each room with slow, deliberate steps, sorting packing, deciding what to keep and what to leave behind. Every photograph, every trinket, every piece of furniture seemed to carry a memory, some more comforting than others, but I no longer felt trapped by them. They were fragments of a life well lived, but they didn't have to be anchors. The sale had gone through faster than I expected. The real estate agent was delighted with the offers that came pouring in. This neighborhood was thriving, and the house, despite its age, held a classic charm that buyers adored. But for me, it was never about the value printed on a contract. It was about releasing myself from the weight of this place, from the ghosts that lingered in every corner, from the expectations that had held me hostage for far too long. I stood in the kitchen one last time, running my hand across the smooth countertops where I had prepared countless meals, hosted family gatherings, and spent too many nights alone. Then I walked to the living room, letting my fingers graze the bookshelves, touching the spines of novels that had comforted me through widowhood. I paused at the display cabinet that once housed Daniel's precious coin collection. Now empty, it seemed less like a loss and more like a declaration of my freedom. The real estate agent had arranged for the movers to come the following morning, but I knew there was one more room I needed to visit before I could truly say goodbye. Daniel's study. The room where everything began to unravel and where, strangely enough, everything also began to make sense. I walked down the hallway and pushed open the door. The air inside was thick with memory, with years of quiet evenings spent listening to Daniel mumble about market trends, polish coins, and scribble into his leather-bound journals. The desk, now cleared of most things, still stood strong by the window, its polished surface gleaming softly in the afternoon light. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me, letting myself take in every detail one final time. I walked over to the desk, sitting down in the chair where Daniel had spent countless hours, and allowed myself to breathe. I wasn't angry anymore. Not at Daniel for his secrets, not at Ethan for his betrayal, not even at myself for not seeing things sooner. I had faced every harsh truth, made peace with every painful revelation, and now I was simply done. On the desk was a single folder, copies of the final will, the letters from Emma, and the legal confirmations Grant had sent over. Everything was in order. Everything Daniel had wanted, even if he had been too afraid to say it aloud, was now being honored. Emma would receive what was rightfully hers. I would no longer be the woman they could manipulate. Ethan would have to reckon with his own actions, and I would carry no guilt over it. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out over the garden that Daniel had so lovingly tended. The jasmine bush near the fence was in bloom again, its white flowers glowing like little stars. I smiled softly. For so many years I had believed this house, this life, was all I could ever want. But standing there, I realized I had been wrong. There was still a world out there waiting for me. Places I had dreamed about but never visited, cultures I had read about but never experienced. I walked over to my bedroom and stared at the open suitcase waiting on the bed. Tucked inside were simple clothes, comfortable shoes, a camera, and a small travel journal. No more oversized handbags filled with other people's things. No more planning my days around anyone else's needs. This trip wasn't about escaping, it was about rediscovering myself. My first destination was already booked: Athens, Greece. Daniel had always wanted to go, always spoke of walking through the ruins, of seeing the Acropolis bathed in the morning sun, of tracing history through narrow, cobbled streets. He never made it. But I would. Not because I owed it to him, but because I owed it to myself, to finally go somewhere simply because I wanted to. As the afternoon faded into evening, I found myself back in Daniel's study one last time. I looked around feeling no sadness, just closure. This room had witnessed my devotion, my heartbreak, my awakening, and now it would witness my final goodbye. I walked to the center of the room, closed my eyes, and whispered to no one in particular I was a wife. I was a mother. I gave everything I had to everyone else, and for a time I believed that was enough. My eyes opened, landing on the last remnants of my old life. Files, certificates, forgotten letters. I smiled softly. But I am more than that, I whispered again. I am a woman with stories yet to live, dreams yet to chase, and days yet to be claimed. I switched off the light, walked out, and closed the door gently behind me. That night, as I sat on my porch with a cup of tea, I allowed myself to think of the places I would soon see: the turquoise waters of the Aegean, the hills of Santorini, the bustling markets of Athens. I imagined myself walking through history, eating food I'd never tried, meeting people whose lives were completely different from mine. I imagined waking up each morning knowing the day ahead was mine to decide, free of obligation, free of guilt. When the stars blinked to life above me, I took a slow breath, closed my eyes, and smiled. I had spent my life giving. To a husband who held secrets, to a son who took me for granted, to a family that forgot who I was when they no longer needed me. But now I had chosen myself, and it was the most liberating feeling in the world. My flight was in 3 days, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, I was counting down, not out of dread, but out of excitement. I had spent my life giving. Now it was time to live for me. Have you ever found yourself giving everything, your time, your love, your entire life, only to be left behind when you needed others the most? Have you ever been made to feel like a burden in a house you helped build, in a family you sacrificed everything for? If you've ever felt unappreciated, unheard, or forgotten, know that you are not alone. Your story matters. Your worth does not disappear with age. You have every right to stand tall, to reclaim your dignity, and to live for yourself. What would you have done in Bethany's place? Would you have fought back, or walked away to start fresh? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to our channel and don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our future life stories filled with strength, resilience, and quiet triumph. Your voice matters. Join us in celebrating the strength of women who choose themselves.